Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our December VCE Small Scale Fruit webinar with the VCE Small Fruit Program and the VCE EMG program. Today, we're going to learn about Asian pears and how to grow Asian pears successfully in Virginia with Jason Mattson. As a reminder, this is going to be recorded and posted on our EMG webinar archive after the program. A few housekeeping items. Please put your questions in the chat. We'll review them at the end, and feel free to put as many questions as you have in the chat. If Jason answers them while he's presenting, we won't answer them again at the end, but it's fine to ask your questions in the chat as we're going. I hope you have pen and paper with you. Jason's presentations are usually full of excellent information. And if you need to go back and watch the recording afterwards, that is perfectly fine. So without further ado, Jason, would you like to introduce yourself and start teaching us about Asian pears?
Well, thank you for everyone for joining me today with my discussion on growing Asian pears in Virginia. Um, I've been working in the tree fruit industry for about 30 years now. I was born and raised in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I'm a graduate of Delaware Valley University in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. I started growing fruit while I was at the college and managed their fruit and vegetable operation there for a number of years, and then moved into more commercial production in Eastern Pennsylvania. And about 10 years ago, I found myself down in Central Virginia growing fruit. Over the last 8 years, I've grown tree fruit and ornamental nursery stock for Saunders Brothers in Piney River, Virginia. And we have roughly about 180 acres in fruit production right now. And that's one of my main responsibilities on the farm here, along with growing about 180 acres of field-grown boxwood. So today we'll be talking about Asian pears. They are one of my most favorite tree fruit. And for backyard growers, I don't think there's many other types of tree fruit that compare. They're generally fairly easy to grow and very conducive to backyard settings or small orchard settings. So a little introduction about Asian pears. Uh, there are two types of pears grown in Virginia, the European pear or Pyrus communis. They're the most common on the market right now. And these pears are picked when they're mature, but they're not ripe, or at least they're not ready to eat when they're harvested. Um, and they're kind of known for their classic teardrop or pear shape. Now, Asian pears have a tendency to be have a little bit more of a wow factor to them. They're developed from several species of Pyrus genus, but they're generally considered Pyrus serotina. And these are marketed by other names like sand pears and Chinese pears and Japanese pears, or even apple pears. And typically they're round in shape, unlike their European counterpart. Um, Asian pears, they originated in China and Japan, and they've been cultivated for over 3,000 years. And they are first introduced into the United States in the early 1800s by horticulturist William Prince in New York. Chinese and Japanese immigrants brought the fruit to the West Coast during the 1800s, during the gold rush. And they are initially grown in gardens before commercial production prospered in California and Oregon. So there are some requirements for growing Asian pears. There's a dormant period or chilling hours required, and generally 500 to 1200 hours are required. And this is hours below 45 degrees. Generally speaking, we don't have problems meeting these chilling requirements in Virginia. Sometimes on the East Coast, there could be some issues with getting those chilling requirements, but generally speaking, I don't think you should have any issues. Fully dormant trees can survive temperatures as low as 25 degrees. And typically we don't have those temperatures in Virginia, so we should be pretty safe here. Um, Asian pears are less hardy than apples, but most do withstand the minimum temperatures that we have here in Virginia. So now we're going to discuss bloom and pollination. That's something to consider when you're selecting the varieties and thinking about your orchard plans. So pears require cross-pollination, and generally at least two varieties are needed with a overlapping bloom window. They bloom about 7 to 10 days earlier than apples, upwards of a week earlier than European pears. And the open bloom are sensitive to freeze or to frost, and they can be killed with temperatures below 25 degrees.
Non diciamo no.
One of the very first things you should start to consider when planning an orchard or planning to plant some fruit trees in your yard is the site. Site selection is critical for the longevity of your orchard. Uh, so one of the factors you want to consider is air drainage and frost. Pears are highly sensitive to spring frost and injury during bloom, and cold air drains to lower elevations and can collect there. It acts similar to water, where it wants to drain to the lowest elevations. Cold air is very dense, more dense than warm air, and it just wants to settle into your low pockets. So you want to avoid planting in low sites, bottomlands, sites along creeks usually have a tendency to be on the lower end or streams. Um, and also avoid sites that maybe drain or the lower elevations are blocked by wood lines. If you do need to plant close to a wood line, at least leave plenty of space for the air to drain. Um, Another thing that's really important to consider is the slopes and elevations. Southern facing slopes tend to warm earlier, and sometimes this can lead to early bud swell and bloom, and that could put the tree at risk to early frost. Northern facing slopes have less issues with this and can reduce that risk. Hilltops give you really good protection from these thermals or these temperature variants. However, you do leave yourself exposed to wind. Commercial growers have a tendency to favor elevations between 800 and 1,000 feet or even higher. Actually, I would say 800 to 2,000 feet is probably more ideal. And the reason is because you have less variations in temperature at those heights. You will have things will warm up later at those elevations, but you won't have the fluctuations of warm days and cool nights that could potentially cause damage on the bloom. Um, so an ideal site is elevated land. Even a few feet of elevation can determine crop survival in frost situations. And a 4 to 8% slope is ideal for good air drainage. And you also want to consider balanced wind protection. Another thing to consider with site selection is water drainage. That's another critical factor for the longevity of your orchard. Pears are most tolerant of all tree fruit to wet soils. So if you are planting multiple species of tree fruit, pears you can usually err on the side of caution, put them on the lower end of the field, and put your stone fruit and other varieties of tree fruit higher up, ones that are more sensitive to wet feet. Um, you do want to consider, though, if you put it in a really boggy or marshy area or with wet soils or heavy soils, the roots cannot tolerate being wet for several days in a row. Injury will occur at that point. So you can evaluate the drainage of your soil by digging a hole 2 to 3 feet deep. If you fill that, usually after a 1 inch rain, if you fill up that hole with water, it should drain within 3 days. If that hole doesn't drain within 3 days, you know your soils don't have adequate drainage, and you might have to do something to improve the drainage, either by choosing another site or potentially by putting in some drain tile or other mitigating factors. The depth of the soil should also be considered, and you want a depth of at least 18 inches, ideally up to 36 inches before you reach a hard pan or rock. Just keep in mind that soil depth and drainage are not easily corrected after planting, so you want to do that before planting. Fertility is another thing to consider before you plant your orchard or before you plant your Asian pears. The pears thrive on deep, well-drained loam and sandy loam soils. Medium fertility is recommended, but you want to be cautious not to add too much nitrogen. Too much nitrogen could lead to increased risk of diseases like fire blight. So a balanced nutrition program favors fruit production, and a program that would be heavy on nitrogen would lead it more toward vegetative growth and less fruit production. Another thing to consider is the organic matter of your soils. Organic matter improves soil structure, aeration, and moisture. So usually you're looking for a 3 to 6% rate of organic matter in your soil. If you're out by Virginia Beach area in the sandier soils, 2% is okay. But you just have to fertilize a little bit more regularly there, and you increase your nitrogen in those soils. So soil pH and amendments are something else you want to consider. Ideally, you want the soil pH to be between 6.2 and 6.8. So proper pH optimizes nutrient availability and uptake. Virginia soils are generally acidic, so liming is often required. And I usually recommend applying this in the fall or in December or January. Low pH can cause nutrient deficiencies in calcium and magnesium, and it also cause aluminum toxicity. So I do recommend soil testing before planting. You want to test your soils. You can consult your local extension agent for soil test kits, and the soils lab would test your soil. And when you get your soil results back, they will have recommendations for the crop that you're growing. If your soils are heavy in phosphorus or potassium, generally you don't need to add anything extra. But if they are not, if you do need to add phosphorus and potassium, I'd recommend like a 10-10-10 or a 5-10-10 at maybe about a quarter pound of fertilizer per tree. You can go a little lighter if you wanted and go with a 10-20-20 fertilizer. And usually you want to apply that fertilizer within a 3-foot area around the tree. For mature trees, I would recommend continuing to soil test at least every other year. Maintain your knowledge or your awareness of what your soil fertility is like. And when you do need to apply fertility or nutrition later on, apply it to the drip line around mature trees. So now let's go over some procedures for planting. So The best time of year I feel to plant trees is in the fall, late fall or early winter. Unfortunately, most nurseries don't start digging trees until late winter or early spring. But if you're able to find bare root trees in the fall, dormant bare root trees, I'd recommend planting them in the fall. Commercially, generally speaking, we do plant them in the spring or late winter. Um, Root growth will occurs when the soil temperatures are about 45 degrees, so keep that in mind when planting. Um, the best root growth occurs when the roots begin to grow before the leaves are produced on the trees. When you plant, the roots should be moist. I recommend planting or putting the roots or soaking the roots for 30 to 60 minutes in tepid water or room temperature water. And when you prepare the hole for planting, you want to dig the hole at least 18 inches deep and 18 inches wide. And I think that's a general rule of thumb. You do want to take in consideration the size of the root mass. If you have a large root mass, you may need a larger hole. If you have a smaller root mass, you may need something slightly smaller. But generally speaking, I like to keep the hole a little bit larger than the root mass. Um, Anecdotally, I've read that it's better to dig a square hole rather than a round hole because the way the roots grow, they have a tendency to grow toward the corners and they branch out a little further rather than making a whorl around that hole that you dig. Um, you do want to remove and or prune out any broken roots. If any of the roots are extremely long, you can shorten them so they fit into the hole. And you want to plant the tree at the same depth that it is planted in the nursery. Generally speaking, that's about 4 inches, 3 to 4 inches below the graft union. So, as we'll talk a little bit later, all commercially produced fruit trees in North America are grafted, and there's two parts to the tree: the rootstock, which is the portion that anchors the tree to the ground and controls the size, and the scion, which is the varietal portion that's above ground. So after you first put your root system in the hole, you want to partially backfill the hole and tamp down the soil onto the roots, so you have good soil to root contact. And and this will help prevent the roots from drying out. And you want to water, and then once you have that done and you're comfortable with the height of the tree, you can backfill in the rest of the hole and then tamp that down by kind of stepping around the hole with your feet and tamping it in. And you'll want to water the tree with at least 2 gallons of water after planting. One other thing to consider after planting is you want to protect the trunk. Uh, Trees, especially in the wintertime, are very sensitive or prone to be or they're targets for mammals, especially rabbits in our area. Rabbits love to chew on the bark of these fruit trees, and they can girdle your trees and and not survive if you're not careful. Rodents also can be an issue. So you could either protect your tree with hardware cloth, or you could use tree guards or cardboard. There's a few different methods or bark protectors available on the market. Another thing to consider too is, generally speaking, the rootstocks available for Asian pears have really good anchorage and don't need support. But I would suggest putting some type of small stake in, at least a stake that you can drive in 2 or 3 feet into the ground and is at least 5 feet out of the ground. So like an 8 foot stake or a 6 to 8 foot stake, just to give it a little bit of support. And while the roots are getting established and you're getting some rigidness to that trunk. So one thing you want to consider before planting is what kind of training system you're going to use. There are three main training systems that I recommend for Asian pears. There's a central leader, which there's one main trunk and about 12 to 16 primary scaffold branches that originate from the trunk. And usually the tree is conical in shape. The open center or open base and consists of 3 to 5 major branches arising from the trunk within 3 feet from the ground, and they're commonly used in commercial stone fruit production. So typically, if you were to see a commercial peach or nectarine block, um, you'll see that open vase training system. It's not as used as much commercially for pears, but in backyard setting, it works really well. The advantage of this system is that a lot of the fruit can be picked from the ground if you open up the center enough, and the competing leaders keep the tree on the shorter side. I recommend more of a modified leader, and that consists of a main trunk with 5 to 7 primary branches or scaffolds arising from the trunk within 6 feet from the ground. And mature trees are usually oval in shape or slightly conical. Um, some diagrams here on the right that point out kind of the progression of how to train a tree to a modified leader. In the first picture, you'll see just a straight whip, and the tree is cut where the lines are dotted. And generally speaking, right after planting, you want to head your tree at roughly 36 inches, and this will set it up to start branching. And the second picture kind of shows you where you'd end up at the end of the first season. At the end of the first season, we're hoping to have a few branches already formed on there, and we want to go ahead and remove any branches that are overly vigorous or competing with the leader, and then also head the leader again to keep it branching, and it also gives it a little more support or a little more strength. And you can see the next, I apologize. Sorry, I jumped slides there. So you can kind of see the natural progression over 3 years here about where the tree winds up. The one thing you want to keep in mind is you want to remove the really vigorous branches, anything that's can compete with the leader. And another thing to consider is the architecture of the tree. So you're really looking for branches with wide crotch angles of 45 to 60 degrees. Um, these wide angles lead to fruiting. Horizontal branching or more level branching tend to grow a little slower and tend to want to bear fruit. You prune off the upright, vigorous water sprouts and also any vigorous branches with narrow crotch angles. And and you could also use some training aids to do this. If your branches are growing too vertically, as they grow, you could use branch spreaders or even apply some weights to the branch or tie them down using some small baling twine and earth anchors. So there's a few different methods that you could use to train the branches to be a little more horizontal. One thing I will point out though is generally speaking, if the branches have the same caliper as the main leader does, they generally don't set up to be good scaffolds, and they generally have tendency to be too vigorous, and you want to prune those out, or at least head them back so they start branching out, and you can take some of the vigor out of them. So there are many varieties of Asian pears, more varieties than are available in the markets we have here in the US. Um, But I'm going to go over a number of key varieties that we grow here or other varieties I know of in the industry that I've grown in the past. And we'll kind of start in progression of the season. So the earliest variety that I have experience growing is Shinseki. It originated as a chance seedling in Japan in 1888, and it's a standard against which other Asian pears are compared. It's a round to oblong fruit. It's greenish yellow to yellow in color, has fairly prominent lenticels, and looks a little bit different with the coloring than some of the other Asian pears. There's no russeting, so it's got a fairly smooth, semi-glossy type finish or skin to it. And it's a medium-sized fruit that must be thinned to achieve good size. This variety does generally set a lot of bloom, and does set a lot of fruit annually. And and typical with most tree fruit, especially pears, is if you overcrop them, you can get into some biannual bearing. So this variety is prone to biannual bearing if you don't thin it well. So usually when the fruit is getting to be about 4 to 8 millimeters, upwards of 15 or 16 millimeters, you'd want to go out and thin your clusters. Starting at the ends of the branches, you want to make sure your clusters are at least are singled down to a single fruit. Occasionally you can leave 2 or 3 in a cluster, but it's much better to thin them down to one or singles. And then you want to have about 8 to 10 inches between every piece of fruit on that branch, and work your way back to the trunk of the tree. And if you do a good thinning, you'll have better fruit size, and you'll also have consistent bearing trees year in and year out. This fruit um, can be small if you overcrop it, so keep that in mind. Um, but if you to achieve good size, you definitely need to thin it. It has a beautiful creamy white flesh that's sweet, crisp, and juicy. Um, it's very, very susceptible to fire blight. It ripens in early August. We can even pick it sometimes in the last week of July here in Piney River, Virginia. And it stores really well. It stores up to 5 months. Um, in the market, this variety with the yellow color does not look as beautiful or as traditional as your standard Asian pear, and also doesn't quite have the size. So from a marketing standpoint, we have a tendency to try to sell this one first before we start bringing out other varieties, or sometimes this one on the shelf doesn't compete as well. Flavor-wise, though, I think it's phenomenal and is really good, and it has some unique flavors to it. Hosui is another variety that we grow here. It was developed in Japan in the 1970s. It's a really large golden fruit. The fruit is not quite as round. It's a little bit more oval in shape. Um, it has very prominent lenticels. It is russeted. Um, it has really exceptional quality and taste. Really good flavor. Another variety that you do need to thin to achieve good size. And this one ripens a few days later, upwards of a week later than the Shinseki does. So these are two varieties that I'm familiar with in the industry, but I don't have a whole lot of experience growing, but I think they're well worth noting. The Kosui is a fairly popular variety. Um, the English translation is good water. It was developed in Japan and released in 1959. It's small to medium fruit, bronze in color. Um, it's more apple shaped, and the fruit ripen just a little bit after Hosui do. And Minakaka is an excellent size, very good size. It's a little bit more on the orangey brown, golden side. Highly russeted. The flesh is juicy and sweet, and it has a heavier texture than most Asian pears. Uh, some of the traditional Asian pear connoisseurs are a little put off by this texture, but I think a lot of backyard growers really appreciate that texture. Um, and I think that texture also lends to its storability. This one can store for up to 6 months. Really nice storage qualities here. So the Olympic pear is one of our favorites here at Saunders Brothers. Uh, it's our largest growing Asian pear that we have. It's also known as Are Rang, or the Korean giant, or Olympic giant. It's a newer variety that was developed in Korea. It's highly russeted. It's golden brown in color, very large size, very round fruit, and the flesh is sweet, crisp, and juicy. This variety does have a tendency to become a little more biannual bearing. Um, so definitely want to thin this variety. Uh, and definitely want to thin the clusters. With the size of the fruit that this variety has, a cluster of two or more pears can really weigh down the tree. Um, but this variety consistently bears very large fruit for us, even on years where it is bearing heavy or has really good fruit set. It's the size is usually not a concern. The only concern with heavy bearing years is that, generally speaking, the following year is a little light. So, generally speaking, thinning the crop is good for overall uniform harvest year in, year out. So 20th century is another very popular variety. Worldwide, it's the most popular. It's also known as Nijiziki. It's a yellow-skinned type, similar to Shinseki in color. A little larger than it's larger than Shinseki though, and and is very susceptible to fire blight. Um, so this one has actually been replaced commercially with Shinseki, and Shinseki is called the new 20th century apple. Um, it's a hybrid of the 20th century, the Shinseki. So I do recommend the Shinseki over the 20th century. Shinseki is still prone to fire blight, but not as susceptible as the 20th century, and it's a little bit more manageable. There's a couple other varieties that I like to note, Yoanashi and Otago. Those are both very golden in color when ripe, larger round fruit. Both have very unique flavors. They almost have a nutty type flavor to them. Both russeted and really good eating pears. They're less prone to fire blight and they produce really well for us here at Saunders. So now we're going to jump into rootstock selection. There's less options in rootstocks for pears when you compare them to apples, and even less choices for Asian pears compared to European pears. The real important factor to consider is Asian pears need a very vigorous rootstock, more vigorous than European pears. And the go-to rootstock, generally speaking, in recent years has been, or over the last 2, 3 decades, has been Pyrus betifolia. It's also known as birch leaf pear. It's adapted to poorly drained and wet soils. It's very, very vigorous, more vigorous than Bartlett seedlings. It tends to produce very deep roots, so it performs very well in droughty soils. And it shows good resistance to fire blight and crown gall. The Old Home Farmingdale number 18 is another variety or another type of rootstock that is an option for Asian pears. It's very vigorous and has some moderate resistance to fire blight and has really good anchorage. Old Home Farmingdale also has number 97. That's probably the standard for Old Home Farmingdale rootstocks for pears. A very vigorous rootstock, um, great anchorage. The size is very similar to a domestic seedling or a domestic pear seedling. And another option I have here is Old Home Farmingdale number 87. It's a really good vigor. This is what you would consider a dwarfing rootstock. It has some fire blight resistance. The size of the tree is about 75 to 80% of the standard size tree. Uh, Good anchorage. It's very precocious and wants to start setting up fruit fairly early. Generally speaking, you should be able to start producing fruit within by the third or fourth year. And I think this particular rootstock gets you there a little faster. And it adapts well to different soil types. I'd say the only knock with this rootstock is it your fruit your annual fruit yields might be a little less than they would be on number 97. There's a few other rootstocks to consider. The Pyrus calariana, the calorie pear. Um, they're the invasive species of pear that grow all over the state that environmentalists are trying to get rid of. But if you have a few seedlings grown and you want to graft your own trees, this might be something to experiment with. They're not as winter hardy as some of the other varieties that I've mentioned, but they do perform well in wet soils. And the size is about a standard size tree. They have a little bit of resistance to fire blight and oak root fungus and collar rot. And then maybe a little lesser known variety of flowering pear, Pyrus usurinus, is also extremely cold hardy. It is prone to suckering, has some moderate resistance to fire blight, and adapts well to different soil types. One thing to consider with all these rootstocks is you do want to manage the suckering. They have a tendency to sucker more than apple rootstocks do, and these suckers will have thorns on them. And we found if we cut these suckers in the dormant season after they've already had the whole season to harden off, when we're cutting up those suckers with our bush hog in the spring or after we're done pruning, we have a tendency to pop holes in our tractor tires with the thorns from these rootstocks. So we actually go through and prune these in the growing season while the rootstocks are still green and a little more softer and they mow up a little bit easier and we have less tires that time of year. So now we can get into harvest. Like apples, Asian pears ripen on the tree. Um, they do not all ripen at the same time, and you usually have about a 7 to 10 day window where the fruit ripens. Um, so most varieties will store for about 3 to 5 months at 30 through 32 degrees. And some indicators of ripeness include flesh firmness. Uh, so commercially, we use a device called a penetrometer to measure the pressure of the fruit. And usually we're aiming for 8 to 10 or 11 pounds of pressure, and that helps us determine ripeness. Another indicator that's really helpful for backyard growers is the color. Um, the fruit should be harvested when the color of the skin changes from the green to more of a rusted or golden or yellowish color. So you'll be able to see that background color change, and that'll help you determine when to harvest. Another thing that can help you determine when to harvest is just the ease at which that it's picked. So when you grab the pear, if you're to turn it upside down over the branch that it's hanging from, it should almost slip right off with that motion. If it's fighting you or if it's really tugging on the branch or hanging, it's probably not quite ready to be picked yet. Um, Also, some other things that can help out is in commercial orchards, we use like a starch iodine test where we'll cut the fruit in half and apply iodine, and we reference a chart and we determine how much starch to iodine, how much starch to sugars are in that fruit. Um, and then we could also use a refractometer to check the Brix or the sugar content of the fruit. And those are indicators that are or tools that commercial growers would use to check their fruit. Um, Also, the history of your orchard could really be a good help in deciding when to pick. Generally, certain varieties have a number of days from bloom to harvest, and if you can determine that number of days from bloom to harvest, you can predict when you're going to harvest your fruit every year within a 7 to 10 day window. A couple other things that I didn't put in my slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about pest protection, pest control. There's a few pests you want to consider when growing fruit in your backyard. Um, for Asian pears, they're magnets sometimes for fire blight. So you want to you want to understand that disease. So fire blight is a disease that there's a few parameters that are needed. First, you need temperatures that are above 60 degrees, and usually that also needs to coincide with a wetting event. And also the third factor there would be some way for that fungus, it's a fungal disease, somehow for that fungus to get into the tree. Um, the I'm sorry, it's a bacterial disease. The so when the trees are in bloom, like apples, they're susceptible to fire blight. Um, the bacteria can enter the blossoms and enter into the tree, and then that's where blossom blight would occur, and then that can move within the shoots of the tree and become a bigger problem if you don't prune it out. Um, so understanding fire blight, there are resistant cultivars. There's rootstocks that are more tolerant or resistant to it. And also understanding the growth habits of the tree. I mentioned earlier with nutrition, you don't want to add too much nitrogen because a vigorous succulent tree is more susceptible to blight. Um, Also understanding infection periods. So you never want to prune your trees when it's raining and warm, and you don't want to you also want to consider when you have open bloom on the tree and you have a rain event and the temperatures are above 60 degrees, you're likely going to have an infection period. So commercial growers are applying antibiotics like streptomycin to prevent that bacteria to getting into the bloom. And uh, you got to be cautious about that because there is resistance to streptomycin in some states. We're fortunate in Virginia where we do not have resistance. So it is a really good tool for Virginia growers to apply streptomycin when the trees are in bloom. And you can apply that every 4 to 7 days during bloom time. And if you're good with those sprays and you have good coverage, you really should have low incidence of fire blight strikes. Um, Also, if you were to get fire blight, you can prune it out. And you just want to prune about at least 18 inches below the infection site. And generally speaking, that infection site is going to be where you had bloom. So that bloom might shrivel up or turn brown, or the leaves right around that bloom might also start to become affected, and the wood on the stem might become gray or blackened and misshapen a little. And those are all good indicators of fire blight. If you get it on the shoot tips, you'll get that classic shepherd's crook. That's a great indicator of fire blight. And so I would recommend you don't necessarily need to prune it out immediately. Sometimes it's better to wait a few weeks just to see if it's spread further down into the stem. And if it hasn't, then prune it out 8 inches below that infection site. And you should be safe from that spreading in the tree any further. Um, another pest, highly economical pest in pear production is pear psylla. This is an insect that generally doesn't affect the growth of the tree. It more affects the fruit quality. And they like to feed on the tree or on the leaves, and a lot of their damage occurs close to harvest. Then they'll excrete uh, honeydew that'll lead to sooty blotch or some discoloration that their excrement will drip onto the fruit and leave black sooty blotch type marks on the fruit. And this is very from a commercial aspect, this is very unsightly and very difficult to market the fruit when it looks like that. Um, from a backyard grower, it's a little bit less of a concern. that can be washed off rather easily. Takes a little bit of elbow grease sometimes to get it off, but it'll look pretty clean once you're done. But from a commercial standpoint, there's a lot of labor involved in getting that fruit clean. And if you don't have the right packing facilities or packing lines to do it, you need to do it by hand, and it's very laborsome. Um, so I've developed a program here at Saunders Brothers, and it's primarily an organically approved program for Parasilla. And this is all a labeled program, and I use a product called Surround. The active ingredient is kale and clay, and by label, you can apply 3 applications from 50 to 100 pounds per acre, um, up to open cluster. So we start at a dormant or semi-dormant state and put out the first application, and every 5 to 7 days after that, I'm applying again for 3 applications in a row. And so the kale and clay or the surround acts as a protectant, and the psylla don't want to move into the fruit and lay eggs on the fruit or on the branches or in the nodes of the tree. I'm sorry. So and it also protects us from other diseases and fungus and bacteria that might be attacking the tree at that time of year. So it gives you it's a multifaceted type protection. Um, and and then I'll also apply that surround 3 other times in season. So, usually about what I would consider my petal fall, I'll apply another application. Usually like 50 to 75 pounds per acre rate is what I'm doing at that time of year. And then my next application would come about 14 to 21 days later, and that would be at my second cover spray. And then I'd do a third application about 7 to 14 days after that. And those 6 applications that I mentioned all together have done wonders for our parasilla control here at Saunders Brothers. When I first started in the orchard about 8 years ago, we had really horrible control of parasilla, and we were scrambling to figure out ways to control it. Uh, our insecticide bill got really costly, and we weren't really having good control. And I just studied the label really closely on Surround and talked to other growers, and this has been really paying off for us. A lot less labor is needed now in our packing house for getting the fruit clean. We have very little parasilla damage, and the fruit looks great. A few other things you want to consider in your orchard as far as pests go. You want to protect your trees from deer or mammals. I mentioned earlier rabbits and rodents, but deer can also come in and chew on your trees. Um, so sometimes fencing is needed, uh, or deer deterrents. There's different sprayable products on the market that you could use to apply that would deter the deer, whether it's from browsing and chewing or the odor would keep them away. And you could also use products like Milorganite. It's a fertilizer product available at Lowe's or Home Depot, and we just stuff little fabric bags and hang them from the tree. And we'll sometimes put them out 2 or 3 times a year even. And that does a really good job keeping the deer or deterring the deer from the trees. And we hang one little bag per tree. In my backyard orchard, I had some old socks that had holes in them, and I just filled one end and tied it off and hung that from the tree, and that kept the deer away from my peach trees in my backyard. So there's varying methods that you can use, but be cautious of deer, especially in the wintertime. They like to get in there and rub. In the late winter, early spring, they like to get in there and chew on your fruit buds. So be cautious of the deer. Uh, Also, when your tree gets growing, the other insect you might want to consider putting an insecticide out or treating with for is either aphids, leafhoppers, or leaf rollers. And they're mostly a concern in years 1 and 2 when you're really establishing your tree. They like to go out after young succulent growth, and they can really slow down your tree when you're trying to train it. For a backyard grower, just a insecticidal soap and a small squirt bottle would do a good job shooting applying it to your shoe tips, and you could add a couple drops of soap, or you could add some other material to that too, like thyme oil. That is another material that is good for keeping insects away. Um, and one other final thing to note is not only do you protect the trunks from mammals and animals, rodents, you also want to protect it from the sun. You can get sun scald or injury from winter. In the wintertime, when the trees are dormant, during the day, the heat of the sun will warm up that trunk. The trunk has a tendency to be on the darker side in the wintertime, and um, it'll heat up during the day, and then at night it'll freeze and contract. And that expansion during the day and contraction at night can cause trunk splitting. And commercial orchards will usually paint the trunks with a white latex paint. Um, you want to avoid other types of paints, well, oil-based paints, because they can cause damage to the tree, but just a white latex paint is good. Or you could also like whitewash them with lime and water. And there's various methods online that you could look up to see how to do that. The other thing is weed control under the trees. Weeds compete for water and nutrients. Uh, it's very beneficial to control the weeds when establishing trees. Commercial fruit producers use herbicides, both pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides. Um, but weeds can be controlled in the backyard with a hoe or by spreading mulch under the tree. Um, You want to control the weeds to a distance about 3 feet around the trunk. Some mulches, you got to be cautious with mulches because they can provide or a desirable habitat for rodents, and rodents like to feed on the bark and roots. So you want to try to deter them as much as possible. Um, so during as you're getting into the fall season, you want to examine the mulch and make sure there's no evidence of vole activity. And if you do have a vole activity, you're going to want to find some mitigating measures to control them. Um, if you do decide to use herbicides, you want to protect the trunk from contact or avoid herbicide contact on that trunk, especially when the trunk of the tree is young and green and actively growing. Pre-emergents, generally speaking, do not have any ill effect on the trunks, but post-emergence can. And and I feel like a lot of the post-emergence that commercial growers are using have potential to cause other problems. So be very cautious with your post-emergence and avoid any trunk contact. The latex paint, a really thick coat of latex paint can give you protection from these herbicides. And glyphosate is not a bad option if you wanted to try something like Roundup with the active ingredient glyphosate, but only use that early on in the season. I'd say once we get to be July 1st or so, I wouldn't use it any time after that, mostly because of the systemic properties that it has. Um, at that point, you have risk of that herbicide getting down into the root system and killing the whole tree. But still, the glyphosate, you want to avoid any contact with the tree or root suckers best you can. And with that, I think I've covered everything I wanted to go over today, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or give you any advice.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. I have been looking in the chat as we go. There's some questions about, I think you said it and I missed it. How long from the time that you plant a grafted Asian pear tree until you get fruit, you get like a reasonable crop? And I think maybe could you also talk about, especially in the early years, if you, what a crop would look like for a backyard grower, what they can expect, maybe their first crop, second crop, and then like stuff from then on. Because I know there's some stuff that we do commercially to make sure that we're not putting too much on the tree too young. And I assume that you've got some guidelines for that for Asian pears.
Absolutely. So you want to be cautious within the first 2 or 3 seasons about cropping the tree. Um, you want to give that tree ample opportunity to grow and to fill its space and to develop the architecture that you want so it can support a larger crop later on in its life. However, cropping it can help you out in training it. Even in the second or third year, you can start putting some fruit, hanging some fruit on those scaffold branches, and that'll pull your branches down a little bit more horizontal or a little bit better to those angles that you want. Um, Also, if you're not happy with it after it's fruited that season, you can cut it out entirely or cut it back so it regrows. Um, you definitely want to avoid having fruit on your central leader or definitely on the apical leader of the tree. If the leader of your tree starts flopping over, you're never going to achieve the height that you want to get, and your tree will always remain short. Or you might wind up forcing other leaders to grow. And that is something that will happen. You might have a leader that you had in mind through years 1 through 3, and then all of a sudden in the third year, there's another leader that really wants to kind of take the lead. Well, sometimes, maybe the leader that you originally decided was your central leader is no longer performing. You can kind of switch and either cut that piece out or prune it back to the new, more vigorous shoot, or or you can crop that one and let that one kind of become a little bit of a scaffold. Um, so you rule of thumb, the second year, I would say you probably don't want to have much more than 3 to 5 pairs, maybe. Um, Depends on how much growth you can get out of it the first season. And maybe by year 3, you can start to get upwards of 10 to 20 pairs off the tree. And by year 4, you should have some
Mhm.
architecture established and you can start really ramping up your production at by year 4. I would say by year 4, you should be able to get 30 to 60 pieces of fruit off the tree. By year 5, you should start to get closer to your fuller crops. Maybe 40 to 100 pairs, and year 6, 7, 100 pairs or more. Um, but take your time early on, let the tree get established. You can use the fruit to help you train the limbs and pull them down a little bit. Um, and then prune accordingly in the fruiting in the dormant season. That was probably one thing I didn't mention. Ideally, you prune the trees when they're fully dormant. You can do a little bit of summer pruning on some water sprouts that you have or really vigorous shoots, but usually that doesn't happen until years 3 or 4 or later. Early on, most of your pruning will happen in the dormant season.
So good. Um, I I know that Saunders Brothers has a nursery and a farm market available. I also know that Saunders has a commercial grafting operation, but that they don't sell their grafted apples to non-commercial clients. Does Saunders sell Asian pears to homeowners, grafted Asian pear root stocks? And if not, where would you recommend that somebody look to get some high quality stock?
Hello.
We started grafting Asian pears a few years ago, and they are grafting really well for us in our fruit tree nursery. Um, our fruit tree nursery is ramping up over the recent 5, 6 years, and we've nearly doubled our production coming out of our nursery. To this point, we've been primarily just growing apple trees. However, we have started offering pears and peaches and some other stone fruit. And we're even expanding out more beyond that and growing some ornamentals in our bare root tree nursery. Um, and at this point, our fruit trees can be purchased at our own farm market in the springtime or late winter. And generally we do have them most of the year as well. And right now we are primarily catering or selling our fruit trees to other nurseries and commercial growers. Um, you're going to start to see our label at some more smaller retail operations in Virginia, and I think you'll also start seeing them potentially in larger box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot in the near future. We're partnering with some of our other licensed ornamental growers that are already selling fruit trees in containers, and I project that you'll start to see our label in other markets in the next 5 years. Um, there's a number of commercial nurseries currently that you can buy Asian pears from. Adams County is a really nice nursery to buy Asian pears from. They're located in Pennsylvania. Um, let's see. There's many of nurseries out west that you can buy pears from, whether it's uh, Stark Brothers or um, Willamette or uh, you know, many different commercial nurseries. You should have not have any difficulties finding fruit trees. Um, there's smaller nurseries in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Mid-Atlantic region. If you were to get onto Facebook, there's a Facebook group called North American Cyanwood, and it's a network of growers. And if you wanted to get into grafting, you can even buy just budwood and buy in your rootstocks, or maybe graft to rootstocks that you already have and experiment with that, or graft multiple varieties onto one tree if you wanted to experiment with that. Um, and it seems like that market is really starting to boom. The backyard grower. Um, the only thing I would be concerned about is just finding someone that seems a little more reputable, so you know you're getting a variety that's true to name. Um, Generally speaking, the larger commercial orchards, you're safer to get varieties that are true to name. Sometimes from the backyard growers or from some of these Facebook groups, you don't always know what you're going to get. Um, but I think that's where I would start, though.
Yeah, I think some of those nurseries that you listed, we tend to recommend some of the larger ones that you can order online. Make sure you get your order in well ahead of time. That means that you should be thinking about planting significantly in advance of ordering, which should be significantly in advance of receiving your products. And that goes along with all the site selection and soil amendments, things that Jason was talking about earlier for planting. Um, there is also a question here about pollination, and I did my best to answer it based on what I was aware of, but Asian pears are technically self-fertile, but they do a lot better with um, additional pollinating, additional pear varieties, right? Um,
Correct.
And that includes European pears too, right? They play nice with each other, or would you recommend just more Asian pears?
So they will cross-pollinate each other. However, their fruiting windows are a little different. So you want to find an overlap. Like Bartlett will bloom a little earlier, and the window for Bartlett will sometimes overlap with other Asian pears. Um, but generally speaking, a lot of the European pears bloom a little bit later, and most of the Asian pears are already done blooming by the time the European pears start to bloom. But even if you just had two varieties of Asian pears, a lot of times most Asian pears have overlapping bloom periods, and they should be suitable to pollinate.
Yep, that's the most important thing when we're talking about pollination is that the bloom periods overlap. 'Cause you have it and they bloom, they're both blooming. They might be compatible, but we'd never know because they're not blooming at the same time. So that's one of the most common mistakes that I've seen with backyard tree fruit in general. Um, Let me see. I think there was
One other
one
thing to
more.
note,
Go ahead.
they bloom pretty early, and honeybees aren't necessarily always the best choice for pollinizers. Usually the native bees do a little bit better job as they come out a little bit earlier and they're flying a little bit more. But if we get an early spring, you'll still see honeybees out there. But just a little bit of a side note, just in case you were wondering.
Yeah, yeah, and typically we say that in Virginia for most backyard tree fruit, there are enough native and active pollinizers there. A lot of times we don't need additional help. But that's something to be aware of when you're if you do have bees or if your neighbors or anybody nearby has bees, something to be aware of when you're considering your spray program is, critters in the flowers. But there's a lot of really good information on that and about what's safe and what's not safe for the bees. So just make friends with your beekeeper friends nearby. It it can never hurt. Um, there's a question about crab apples serving as a source of pollination. Are crab apples a significant source of pollination for Asian pears, or is that just for apple trees?
I don't generally consider them suitable enough. I feel like they're more helpful for apples and less so in Asian pears. Partially because the bloom period again, but I just don't think they're as compatible as other pear species.
And my opinion on that is if you're planting for yourself in your backyard, if you don't want to eat a crab apple, don't plant a crab apple tree. It's going to be there and take up space and be a host for pests and diseases. And if you're not getting something out of it, don't use your space for that. Plant something you actually, can use, or you can use crab apples, but it's something you actually enjoy or want. And if you're one of the people that likes crab apples, then enjoy it. But I think we have time for one more question, and I had some discussion about pruning. Um, Asian pears should be pruned as a central leader, and I think there's some concern with how big these trees get. I would say something in the 15 to 20-foot range, right, Jason?
That's
Um,
correct.
is there any way to get it smaller and more manageable and still be like respectful to, the pruning rules for that species?
Yes. Once you're getting your tree established, as you're getting to your height that you want, if you have a height in mind for your backyard, if you're aiming for 16 to 18 or 20 feet, I would head it at that point and kind of hold it to that point in future years. So when you do head it, you want to try to head it to a more relaxed or horizontal branch. And and then in future years, you'll be able to see where that cut was. And then you're going to start just removing shoots that would form as a response to that heading cut the year before. And and as long as you kind of keep your water suckers and shoots pruned from the top, you should be able to maintain the height of that tree. Um, it's always good to have. I mean, you could let a flag or a big branch go up and cut it out every year, um, or you could let a big branch go up and fruit it heavily and let it flop over and kind of usually if you can a term in the industry is called crop and flop, where you crop that branch, it'll flop over. It just really wants to set up for vegetative growth, and it kind of slows down the top of that tree a little bit. That's another method that you could use. But you will have a lot of growth at the top of your tree year in and year out, and you always want to maintain that by pruning out your very vigorous shoots. And even for your main scaffolds on the bottom, um, once your scaffolds are established and you've got nice arms on your tree, just leave the really fine, shorter shoots and smaller twiggy branches and take out all the vigorous upright shoots. You could really drastically prune it back every year by taking out all those water sprouts and suckers coming off your scaffolds and just leave the small twiggy stuff. And all that small twiggy branches will set your fruit for you. And it looks very uniform and pretty too when you prune it that way. And you just get rid of anything vigorous and upgrowing, upright in the tree. I want to see if I can go back and find I think I've had a couple pictures. I have great pictures here, but if you can look on the scaffold of this tree that's in bloom, these trees have all been pruned. And this is, they're pruned in dormants while they're dormant. This is, probably sometime in March here. And all the suckers and water shoots were growing straight up off of all these scaffolds and branches. And we just took them all off and left all the relaxed branches on there. Got plenty of bloom on the tree and plenty of fruiting sites. And even with that, we need to go through and thin a lot of the fruit off this tree so we get good fruit size and we get return bloom for the following year.
Awesome, good. I think that was really a really good pruning answer. I think that's what we have in the chat for questions. This has been recorded, so if you want to go back and review some information, please feel free to do so. I also recommend if you've got questions about Asian pears that are not fully answered, there's some really good resources from other mid-Atlantic states. So when you're Googling questions, add EXT to your search results, and you should be able to pull up stuff from Virginia and Penn State that have some good resources. Things will be a little bit different because they're not necessarily in Virginia, but we do have some reference material from Cooperative Extension in Virginia, and there's some useful stuff from other nearby states too. But everybody give Jason a big round of applause and thank him for teaching us about Asian pears today. So thank you, Jason.
It was my pleasure. Thanks everyone for joining me today, and hope I was able to enlighten you on growing Asian pears.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.